There is a river in northern China that runs the color of pale gold. It moves slowly, or at least it seems to move slowly when you stand far enough back and watch it from a gentle distance, the way you might watch a long curtain shifting in a warm breeze coming through an open window on a summer afternoon. The river is called the Huanghe, which in English carries the meaning of yellow river, and it has been flowing through the wide, flat landscape of what is now northern China for longer than any written word can reach. It curves and bends through less plains, less being a fine, pale silt, the color of old linen or dry wheat, soft enough to crumble between the fingers and light enough to drift in the wind like a kind of slow, golden mist. The less settles on everything. It settles on the banks of the river. It settles on the broad, flat fields. It settles on the leaves of whatever trees have managed to root themselves in that quiet, ancient soil. And for thousands and thousands of years, this settling of silt, this patient depositing of layer upon layer of fine golden earth, was the very thing that made life possible in this part of the world. It is good to think about rivers when the mind wants to rest. Rivers move without effort. They do not decide to move. They simply do, following the gentle insistence of gravity, winding through whatever the land offers them, never in a hurry, never looking back. The Yellow River has been doing this for so long that it has become, in a way, a kind of quiet spine around which an entire civilization slowly assembled itself, the way a pearl assembles itself around a single grain of sand. Gradually, unhurriedly, one soft layer at a time. The people who first settled along the banks of the Yellow River are known to us now by the name Neolithic, which simply means they were people of the New Stone Age, people who had learned to shape stone into tools and who had begun, slowly and tentatively, to notice that if you placed a seed in damp, warm earth and waited, something would grow. This noticing was not sudden. It was the kind of gradual understanding that comes from watching the same thing happen, season after season, for generations. A seed falls, rain comes, a green shoot appears, the shoot grows, it flowers, it seeds again. The loop closes and then opens and then closes again. Watching this loop, following this rhythm, was how the earliest farmers along the Yellow River began to understand that the world had a kind of patient, repeating order to it, a slow breathing in and out that they could, if they paid close enough attention, begin to participate in. The most important crop in this part of China in those very early years was millet. Not rice. Rice came later and further south, in the warmer, wetter valleys closer to what is now the Yangtze River. Millet was suited to the north. It was hardy and modest. It asked for relatively little in the way of water. It grew in the less soil with a kind of quiet determination, its thin green stalks rising in long, swaying rows, the seed heads bowing slightly under their own gentle weight when the time came to harvest. The people who grew this millet lived in small villages, clusters of semi-subterranean houses dug partly into the earth for warmth in winter, with low roofs of thatch or woven reed, and floors packed smooth and hard. Inside these houses, it would have been dim and close and warm, smelling of earth and smoke and dried grain, and the sound from outside, wind moving through millet, the distant sound of water, would have come in muffled and soft, the way sound comes through a thick blanket laid over a window. We know something about these people from what they left behind, and what they left behind is often beautiful, in a quiet and understated way. The Yangshao culture, as archaeologists have come to call the people who lived along the central Yellow River from roughly 7,000 years ago, made pottery that has been found in the soil of many sites across that region. The pottery is painted red and black pigments on a pale clay surface, with flowing, curving designs, spirals, waves, fish shapes, and the outlines of creatures that seem to move even when they are still, the way a well-drawn line always seems to carry motion within it. These pots were used for storing grain and water, for cooking, for carrying things. They were practical objects. But the care taken in their decoration suggests that practicality and beauty were never, for these early people, understood as separate things. A pot that held your grain could also carry something lovely on its surface. These two things could exist together without any contradiction, quietly, in the same curved palm of clay. Further east, and slightly later, another culture was assembling itself from the same slow processes of farming, pottery making, and village life. The Longshan culture, named for a site in what is now Shandong province, produced pottery of a different kind, thin-walled, dark, burnished to a deep gray-black sheen that catches the light in a way that feels almost like water at dusk, or the surface of old polished stone. The walls of some Longshan vessels are so thin that they have been compared to an eggshell, and this comparison is apt, not only for the thinness but for the quality of fragility, the sense that something so finely made requires a certain gentleness in handling. These were people who had, over many generations, refined a skill to a remarkable degree of delicacy. The wheel, the slow pottery wheel, turned by hand, had made this possible, allowing the clay to be centered and drawn upward in a way that no hand-building technique could quite achieve. These two cultures, the Yangshao and the Longshan, represent something important in the early story of Chinese civilization, though they do not represent the whole of it. Across the vast territory that would eventually become China, dozens of regional Neolithic cultures were developing in parallel, each one shaped by the particular character of its local landscape. The flatless plains of the north, the river deltas of the east, the subtropical forests of the south, the high and windswept plateaus of the west. These were not a single unified people. They did not share a single language or a single way of doing things, but they shared something larger and quieter than that. They shared the rhythm of seasons, the slow logic of cultivation, and the deep human comfort of gathering at the end of a long day in a warm, low-roofed space, with grain in the store and fire in the hearth. Along the Yangtze River, which flows further south and carries a warmer, more humid world along its banks, a different kind of agriculture was quietly taking root. Rice, which requires standing water and a warmth that the northern plains cannot easily offer, was cultivated here perhaps as early as 7 or 8,000 years ago. The Hemudu culture, discovered at a site near the coast of what is now Zhejiang province, left evidence of rice cultivation that includes not just the grains themselves, preserved in the waterlogged soil with extraordinary faithfulness across the millennia, but also the tools used to tend it, wooden spades and paddles, woven baskets, the quiet inventory of a farming life. These people also raised pigs and dogs, and they built their homes on stilts above the damp ground, which suggests a practical familiarity with the behavior of water, a long-practiced understanding of where the land is reliable and where it tends to soften and give way. The image of a house on stilts above a quiet, slow-moving river, surrounded by the pale green of young rice paddies, with the sound of water below the floorboards and the smell of wet earth and warm grain. This image carries within it something that feels both very old and very familiar, as if it were a memory belonging not to any single person but to some shared and ancient part of human experience. The ground below is soft. The water moves slowly. The house is raised just enough to catch a breath of air from across the patties. Inside, it is warm and dim and still. By the time we reach the period that Chinese historical tradition has come to call the age of the three sovereigns and the five emperors, a period belonging more to legend than to confirmed history, though legend and history have always been comfortable neighbors in the Chinese literary tradition. We are looking at a world that has been slowly, patiently forming itself for thousands of years. The three sovereigns are figures like Fuxi, who is said to have taught people to fish with nets, and Shenong, who is associated with the beginnings of agriculture and herbal medicine, and Nuwa, who in one ancient telling shaped human beings from yellow clay, breathing life into the figures she formed with her own hands. These are not figures we can trace in the archaeological record. They belong to a different kind of knowing, the knowing that comes from stories passed through many mouths over many generations, changing shape slightly with each telling the way a stone changes shape in a river, the edges softening, the outline becoming gentler and more rounded with every slow season that passes. What is interesting is not whether these figures were real in the way that a farmer or a potter is real, but what their stories preserve. Fuxi and the fishing net, the knowledge that nature offers its gifts more readily when you know how to receive them, when you have made the right, patient preparation. Shenong and the grain, the understanding that the earth is generous if you are willing to work with it slowly, to learn its rhythms and follow them. Nuwa and the yellow clay, the sense that human beings are made of the same substance as the earth beneath them, not separate from the landscape but continuous with it, shaped from the same soft, pale, golden lace that lines the banks of the Yellow River and drifts in the wind across the northern plains. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, is the last of the five emperors in most tellings of this ancient cycle, and he is perhaps the most important figure in early Chinese cultural memory. Tradition credits him with an enormous range of inventions and foundations. The writing system, the calendar, the principles of medicine as codified in the ancient text known as the Yellow Emperor's Classic, the silkworm, the making of clothes. None of these things were, of course, invented by a single person. They accumulated, the way everything accumulates slowly across long stretches of time, the contribution of countless unnamed individuals who tried something and found it worked, who adjusted and refined, who passed on what they had learned to the next pair of hands. But to attribute them to Huangdi was to place them within a story, to give them a home in the human imagination, and that is its own kind of truthfulness. The silkworm deserves a moment of quiet attention here, because silk is one of those materials that seems, when you hold it, to have come from somewhere not quite of the ordinary world. The story told in Chinese tradition is that Lizu, the wife of the Yellow Emperor, was sitting beneath a mulberry tree one morning, drinking tea, when a cocoon fell from the branches above into her warm cup. As she reached to remove it, a thread began to unwind from the cocoon, a single, continuous, extraordinarily fine thread, glistening slightly in the morning light, softer than anything she had touched before. She followed the thread, and it kept unwinding, and from that following, from that patient attending to the single thread in the warm water, sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms and the making of silk, is said to have begun. Whether or not this particular morning under the mulberry tree happened as described, it is true that China was producing silk at a very early date. Fragments of silk fabric have been found at Neolithic sites in China that date back more than 5,000 years. The silkworm, Bomix mori, had been domesticated, bred over many generations away from its wild cousins, made dependent on human care, incapable now of surviving without it. The caterpillars were raised on mulberry leaves, carefully tended in shallow trays, their needs attended to with the same patient, daily care that any farming requires. And when they spun their cocoons, the cocoons were gathered and placed in warm water, and the thread was drawn out, one unbroken filament from each cocoon, sometimes a kilometer long or more, and wound onto spools, and eventually woven into something that caught the light in a particular, quiet, luminous way that no other fabric quite manages. To live in a world where silk exists is to live in a world that has decided that beauty is worth the effort of patience. The silkworm takes time. The thread takes time. The weaving takes time. None of it can be hurried without losing something essential. Silk is, in a way, woven patience, the visible result of many careful, unhurried days. The shift from the purely legendary world of the three sovereigns and five emperors into something that begins to touch the confirmed historical record comes with the Xia dynasty, or at least with the question of the Xia dynasty, because the Xia occupies an interesting middle position between myth and archaeology. Chinese historical texts, written much later, describe the Xia as the first dynasty of China, founded by a figure named Yu the Great, who is celebrated for his management of the great floods that in ancient Chinese memory once covered the land. Yu is said to have spent years traveling the rivers of China, dredging channels, redirecting water, carving paths through mountains, so that the floodwater could find its way to the sea. The story of Yu is a story about working with water rather than against it, about the slow, patient, unglamorous labor of channeling and guiding, rather than the impossible effort of stopping. Archaeological sites at places like Erlitou, in what is now Henan province, have revealed what may be the physical remains of the Xia world. Large buildings that suggest a degree of centralized organization, bronze artifacts, evidence of a stratified society in which some people had more than others, and were buried with that difference clearly marked in the goods placed beside them in the ground. The question of whether Erlitou is specifically Xia, or whether it belongs to some other cultural phase not perfectly captured in the later historical texts, is one that archaeologists continue to consider with the careful, measured attention that such questions deserve. But the site is real, and the objects found in it are real, and they speak of a world growing gradually more complex, more organized, more aware of its own accumulated weight. Bronze is worth pausing on here at the threshold of the historical period, because bronze changed things in China in a way that was slow and enormous and quiet, the way all truly large changes are slow and enormous and quiet. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and to make it requires not only the knowledge of how to smelt and combine metals, but also the construction of furnaces, the management of fuel, the creation of molds, the organization of labor across multiple specialized roles. Bronze production is, from the beginning, a social activity. It requires more than one person, more than one skill, more than one generation of accumulated knowledge. The bronzes produced in this early period of Chinese history are often ritual vessels, vessels used in ceremonies of ancestor worship, in offerings to spirits, and to the forces that the people of this time felt moving through the world around them. They are heavy, serious objects, with thick walls and elaborate surface designs, touty masks, birds, serpents, geometric patterns that seem to fold in on themselves. And they have a quality of weight and permanence that suggests they were made for something lasting, something that was meant to outlive the people who made them. There is something deeply restful about thinking of these ancient objects, still sitting in the ground, still waiting quietly in the soft, soil, while the world above them continued to turn and change and forget and remember. An object in the earth is the stillest thing there is. It has, in a way, already done everything it needed to do. It has only to wait, and the earth is patient, and waiting suits it very well. By the time the Shang dynasty established itself with more certainty in the historical record, roughly from the 17th or 16th century before the Common Era, the basic patterns of a very long civilization were already in place. Agriculture, ceramics, bronze working, the veneration of ancestors, the slow accumulation of tradition. What the Shang added, and what makes the Shang particularly significant in the story of Chinese culture, is writing. Not the first suggestion of writing, perhaps, but the first fully developed, clearly legible, undeniably present writing system that can be read, at least in part, by Chinese scholars today. These are the oracle bones, flat pieces of ox shoulder blade or turtle shell, inscribed with questions directed to the ancestors and to divine forces, then heated until they cracked, and the pattern of the cracks interpreted as the answer. The questions were often practical and quiet in their concerns. Will the harvest be good this year? Will the king recover from his illness? Will the rain come? The questions of people who lived close to the rhythms of the natural world and understood that those rhythms were not entirely within human control. The characters inscribed on these bones are recognizably the ancestors of the characters still used in Chinese writing today, though they have changed enormously over the long centuries of use. Simplifying and standardizing and shifting shape the way a path through a forest shifts shape over generations of feet following it. That continuity is remarkable, not dramatic or startling, but quietly, steadily remarkable. The way an old tree is remarkable, simply by having been there through so much. The Yellow River continues to flow, as it has always flowed, carrying its pale silt toward the sea. The Less continues to settle on the banks, layer upon soft layer, building up the land with the patient thoroughness of something that has all the time in the world. The millet still grows in the north, and the rice still grows in the south, and somewhere in the carefully tended warmth of a mulberry garden, a silkworm is spinning its fine, continuous, luminous thread, patient, unhurried, soft, adding one slow layer to the long, quiet, ancient story of a civilization that began beside a golden river and learned, from the very beginning, the particular and irreplaceable value of taking things slowly. There is a quality to old maps that the mind finds restful. The lines are soft with age, the colors faded to the gentle amber and ochre of dried leaves, the borders uncertain and shifting, drawn by hands that understood, even as they drew, that what they were capturing was only a temporary arrangement, a particular breath held for just a moment before the slow exhalation changed everything again. The map of ancient China is like this. Its borders move, its centers shift. Its dynasties rise and settle and fade, and are replaced by other dynasties, each one leaving behind something of itself in the soil, in the language, in the way people understood their place beneath the wide, pale sky. To follow the story of China's dynasties is not to follow a story of sudden changes and sharp turns, but rather to watch a very long, very slow river find its course, bending here, widening there, depositing its silt in one place for a time, then quietly redirecting itself somewhere else, always moving, always patient, always carrying forward everything it has gathered. The Shang dynasty, which we left at the end of the last chapter, inscribing its careful questions onto the flat, smooth surfaces of turtle shells and ox bones, continued for several centuries in the warm, agricultural heartland of what is now northern China. The Shang world was not a large one by the standards of what came later. It was centered on the middle reaches of the Yellow River, in the fertile plain where the less soil was deep and workable, and the river brought, season after season, the gift of its silt. The capital moved several times during the Shang period, as capitals in ancient China often did practical decisions, responses to flooding or political pressure, or the slow exhaustion of local resources. The final Shang capital, at a place called Yin near the modern city of Anyang in Henan province, was a substantial settlement, a place of royal tombs, bronze foundries, workshops, temples, and the quiet, daily industry of a population that had organized itself around the needs and rituals of a royal court. The Shang kings were not merely political leaders in the way we might understand political leadership today. They were intermediaries, figures who stood between the living world and the world of the ancestors, who had the authority and the knowledge to communicate with the forces that govern the harvest, the weather, the outcome of military campaigns, the health of the royal family. The oracle bone divination that we described in the previous chapter was not a peripheral or occasional practice. It was central to the way the Shang understood governance itself. Before a significant decision was made, the bones were consulted, the cracks were read, the answer was recorded, and the record was kept, which is why we have so many of these bones today, accumulated in royal archives across hundreds of years of careful record-keeping, patient scribes pressing their characters into the flat surfaces with a steady hand. The bronze vessels produced during the Shang period are among the most distinctive and quietly extraordinary objects in the history of human making. They are large and dark and heavy, with a kind of settled gravity that suggests they were always meant to outlast the people who made them. The most characteristic form is the ding, a cauldron that stands on 3 or 4 legs, with 2 upright handles rising from the rim. The ding was used in ritual feasts offered to the ancestors, the cooked food placed inside it, the steam rising slowly in the still air of the ritual space, carrying the offering upward in the gentle, unhurried way that steam always moves, dissolving gradually into the larger air. Some ding vessels are small enough to hold in both hands. Others are enormous. The largest Shang ding known, called the Humawu ding, weighs more than 800 kilograms and stands nearly 1.33 meters tall. To have made such a thing required not only extraordinary technical skill, but an enormous organization of labor, a pooling of knowledge and effort across many hands and many days. The surface of the Shang bronzes is covered, almost always with decoration, and the decoration has a quality that repays slow, quiet attention. The taodi, the most characteristic motif, is a face, or perhaps 2 faces, seen simultaneously from the front and the side, merged together in a way that is both clear and ambiguous, as if the face is always in the process of becoming itself. There are large eyes, usually round or squared, staring outward with an expression that is not hostile but is certainly serious, attentive, present. There are horns or ears rising from the top of the head. There is sometimes a body and sometimes only the face. The meaning of the taodi has been debated by scholars for a very long time, and the debate has not reached a definitive conclusion, which is perhaps fitting, because the taodi itself seems to resist definitive conclusions. It is a thing that rewards continued looking without ever quite arriving at an endpoint. The transition from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty, which occurred in the 11th century before the Common Era, is one of those moments in Chinese history that was felt, and written about, and thought about, for an extremely long time afterward. The Zhou, a people who had been living to the west of the Shang heartland, gradually accumulated power and eventually overthrew the last Shang king in a conflict that was later remembered as the consequence of that king's moral failings. His cruelty, his excess, his neglect of the rituals that kept the relationship between the living and the ancestral world properly maintained. Whether or not this particular moral framing is historically accurate in its details, it introduced into Chinese political thought a concept that would prove enormously durable and enormously important: the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven, Tiananmen in Chinese, is a way of understanding political authority that is both pragmatic and philosophical, and it works in a quiet, circular way. Heaven, not heaven in a specifically religious sense, but something more like the encompassing moral order of the universe, grants its mandate, its authority to a ruler who governs well, who maintains proper rituals, who cares for the people, who keeps the world in the kind of balanced, harmonious order that heaven approves of. If a ruler ceases to do these things, if the dynasty grows corrupt or negligent or cruel, heaven withdraws the mandate. Floods come. Famines come. Rebellions arise. And eventually, a new ruler emerges from the disorder, one who has demonstrated by the very fact of their success that heaven has transferred its mandate to them. The old dynasty fades. The new dynasty begins. The cycle continues. This idea is not merely a political justification for whoever happens to be in power, though it was certainly used that way at various times. It is also a genuine philosophical claim about the relationship between human governance and the larger order of things. The understanding that how a society is organized and how its people are treated is connected, in deep and important ways, to the natural world, to the rhythms of rain and harvest and flood, to the slow turning of the seasons. A dynasty that keeps the world in harmony, that maintains the rituals and the relationships that hold the human and the natural in proper balance, will be supported by the world it governs. A dynasty that disrupts that harmony will, eventually and inevitably, be undone by the very disruption it has created. The Zhou dynasty lasted, in one form or another, for almost 8 centuries, longer than any other dynasty in Chinese history. This is a remarkable span of time, a span so long that it contains within it enormous change, enormous variation, and several quite distinct periods that feel almost like separate dynasties in themselves. The early Zhou period, known as the Western Zhou because the capital was located in the west of the Zhou territory, near the modern city of Xi'an, was a time of relative stability and of the gradual elaboration of the ritual, musical, and administrative systems that would provide the blueprint for Chinese governance for centuries to come. The Zhou kings distributed land to relatives and allies, creating a network of regional lords who owed loyalty and service to the royal center, a system that has sometimes been compared to European feudalism, though the comparison, like all such comparisons across very different contexts, is only partially illuminating. Music was important in the Zhou world in a way that might seem surprising until you understand the Zhou view of music's relationship to order. The ritual music performed at court and at ancestral ceremonies was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was governance, a way of attuning the participants to the proper relationships and the proper feelings that held a well-ordered society together. Different musical modes were associated with different social functions, different seasons, different ritual occasions. The instruments, bronze bells arranged in sets of graduated sizes, stone chimes, stringed instruments, wind instruments of bamboo, were played together in a carefully organized ensemble, and the resulting sound was understood to have effects that extended beyond the ritual space itself, harmonizing the community, aligning the human world with the rhythmic order of the natural world above and below it. To hear this music in the right way, in the right frame of mind, was to be gently reminded of your place in the larger order of things, which is, in its own way, a form of comfort. Bronze bells from the Zhou period have been found in remarkable quantities and in a remarkable state of preservation, and they are objects of great beauty. The largest sets, called Bayanzhang, consist of dozens of bells arranged in rows on a wooden frame, each bell of a slightly different size and therefore a slightly different pitch, capable of producing, when struck in the right sequence, a rich and resonant sound that carries both clarity and warmth. In 1978, a set of 65 such bells was excavated from the tomb of a Zhou-era aristocrat named Marquis Yi of Zheng, in what is now Hubei province. The bells had been hanging silently in the earth for more than 2,400 years, and when they were brought out and cleaned and tested, they still played, still produced, from the bronze that had been poured and shaped and tuned so long ago, a sound that moved through the air of the modern room with the same steady resonance it had carried in the ancient one. The Western Zhou gave way, in 771 before the Common Era, to the Eastern Zhou, when the royal capital was moved eastward under pressure from tribes to the west. And the Eastern Zhou contains, within its long span, two of the most important periods in all of Chinese intellectual history, the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. These names carry, in Chinese historical memory, something of the quality of the weather they describe. The Spring and Autumn period, named for a historical chronicle attributed to Confucius, has a suggestion of seasonal transition, of change happening gradually and in the expected rhythm of things, while the Warring States period carries in its name the image of something more turbulent, more contested, a world in which the old order had fragmented into competing states and competing ideas, each one pressing its claim with increasing urgency. And yet, from this turbulence, or perhaps because of it, came something astonishing, though that word should be understood here in the gentlest possible sense, the way you might be astonished by a sunrise you have seen many times before but which, on a particular morning, catches you in a particular quality of stillness and reveals itself with unusual clarity. The period of the Warring States was also the period of the 100 schools of thought, when the philosophical traditions that would shape Chinese culture for the next 2.5 millennia were taking shape in the minds and writings of a number of remarkable individuals, each one sitting with the same fundamental questions about how a human life should be lived, how a society should be ordered, what the relationship between the individual and the natural world should be, and arriving at different, quietly considered answers. Confucius, Kongzi in Chinese, the Master Kong was born in the state of Lu in 551 before the Common Era, and his life was, in many ways, a quiet one. A teacher, a scholar, a man who spent much of his life traveling between the courts of various states, hoping to find a ruler willing to implement his ideas about proper governance, and largely failing to find one, and yet continuing to teach, to think, to gather students around him in the simple, unhurried way of a man who believes that the conversation itself is worth having regardless of whether it immediately changes anything. What Confucius taught was essentially about relationships, the 5 key relationships that he believed structured human life: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger brother, friend and friend. Each relationship had its proper character, its proper feelings, its proper forms of behavior. To maintain these relationships in their proper form was to maintain the social fabric. And to maintain the social fabric was to allow the quiet, steady flourishing of human life that Confucius considered the highest goal of governance and of personal cultivation alike. The ideas of Confucius were not immediately adopted and spread. His own life was, in many external respects, a failure. He did not find the prince who would give him the opportunity to put his ideas into practice. But the conversations he had with his students were recorded and gathered into a text called the Analects, a collection of short exchanges and observations that has been read, copied, memorized, debated, and meditated on by more people, across more centuries, than almost any other text in human history. The Analects has the quality of a book that can be returned to at different points in a life, and found to mean something slightly different each time, not because it has changed, but because the reader has, because the slow accumulation of living brings new understanding to the same quiet, carefully placed words. The Qin dynasty, which followed the Long Zhou period, was brief by the standards of Chinese dynasties, only 15 years in its unified form, from 221 to 206 before the Common Era. But its impact was enormous and lasting, in the way that a stone dropped into still water creates rings that spread far beyond the point of impact. The first Qin emperor, Qin Shi Huang, unified for the first time the various competing states of the Chinese world under a single centralized authority, standardized the writing system, the weights and measures, the axle width of carts so that the roads and the ruts worn into them could be used uniformly across the empire, and began the construction of massive infrastructure projects, roads, canals, walls, that stitched the newly unified territory together into something that felt, for the first time, like a single coordinated whole. It is in the nature of things built to last that they outlast the intentions of the people who built them, and the Qin Empire did not last long. But the idea of unity, the idea that the many states and peoples and landscapes of the Chinese world belong together under a single governing authority, that the world had a natural tendency toward coherence, and that disorder was a departure from that tendency rather than the norm. This idea lasted, and lasted, and lasted. It became one of the most persistent and fundamental assumptions of Chinese political culture, that unity is the natural state, and fragmentation is the condition that needs to be explained and healed. The Han dynasty, which succeeded the Qin after a brief period of civil conflict, took the Qin achievement of unification and built upon it something more durable, more humane, more philosophically considered. The Han lasted, with one significant interruption, for 4 centuries, from 206 before the Common Era to 220 of the Common Era, and in those 4 centuries it laid down patterns of governance, scholarship, and social organization that defined China for so long afterward that the Han name itself became, in time, the name by which the majority ethnic group of China is still known today. To call yourself Han Chinese is to carry in your name the memory of an empire that flowered quietly and steadily along the banks of the Yellow River more than 2,000 years ago. The Han court adopted Confucianism as its official ideology, which meant that the examination of classical texts and the cultivation of the Confucian virtues became the pathway to official appointment, to the administrative positions that kept the vast empire functioning in its daily, practical operations. This decision shaped Chinese society in profound ways, creating a class of educated, text-centered officials, the scholar gentry, sometimes called the mandarins in Western literature, who formed the backbone of Chinese governance across many subsequent dynasties. To study, to pass examinations, to know the classics by heart, to be able to write in the cultivated style that demonstrated proper education. These were the paths to authority and to social standing, and they were paths that, at least in principle, were open to anyone with the intelligence and the discipline to follow them. The Han period was also a time of gradual expansion, westward along the corridors of what would become the Silk Road, southward into territories that had not previously been part of the Chinese political world, northward in the ongoing effort to manage the relationship with the nomadic peoples of the steppe whose world began where the settled, farming world of China ended. These expansions were not swift or dramatic in their unfolding. They accumulated, year by year, season by season, like the less accumulates on the riverbank, each year adding a small amount to what was already there, until, looking back from a distance, you could see that the landscape had fundamentally changed. The fall of the Han dynasty, which came gradually in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries of the Common Era, was the beginning of a long period of fragmentation that Chinese historical memory calls the Three Kingdoms period and its aftermath. A time when the unity that the Qin had achieved and the Han had sustained dissolved slowly into competing regional powers, each one claiming legitimacy, each one hoping to reconstitute the whole. This period lasted for several centuries and was marked by suffering, by displacement, by the movement of populations southward across the Yangtze River as the northern plains became less secure. But it was also a period of remarkable cultural creativity, of poetry and philosophy and painting, as if the dissolution of political certainty freed something in the human imagination, some quiet inner life that had been waiting for the official world to step back a little, to create a space in which other kinds of knowing could breathe. The Sui dynasty, which reunified China briefly in the late 6th century, and the Tang dynasty, which followed and built upon the Sui achievement across nearly 3 centuries from 618 to 907, brought China once again into a period of coherence and outward confidence. The Tang capital at Chang'an, the modern city of Xi'an, was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world at its height, a place where merchants, diplomats, monks, artists, and scholars from Central Asia, Persia, India, Korea, Japan, and the Byzantine world moved through the wide, grid-planned streets, exchanging goods and ideas and practices in the gradual, daily way that exchange happens in any busy, open city. The silk market smelled of dyes and dust, and something faintly sweet, the way expensive cloth always carries a suggestion of sweetness. The markets for spices and glassware and exotic animals brought color and texture from the far western world into the orderly, structured space of the Tang city. Musicians played instruments that had traveled from Persia and Central Asia and been gradually absorbed into the Chinese musical tradition, their sounds changing slightly with each performance, adapting to local sensibilities, finding the notes that resonated most clearly in the Chinese ear. The Song dynasty, which followed the collapse of the Tang and a period of fragmentation, and which lasted from 960 to 1279, represents in some ways the quietest and most inward of the great Chinese dynasties, and for that very reason, it is one of the most interesting. The song did not expand militarily in the way the Han or the Tang had done. It was, for much of its existence, under pressure from powerful states to the north, the Liao, the Jin, the eventual Mongol Empire, and it managed this pressure through diplomacy and the payment of tribute rather than through military confrontation. This was sometimes experienced as humiliation, and it generated real political debate about what the proper response to external pressure should be. But it also created the conditions for an extraordinary flowering of culture, technology, and commerce. It was during the Song period that China produced what historians sometimes describe as a pre-modern economic revolution. The development of paper money, of sophisticated banking and credit systems, of large-scale commercial networks that connected distant regions of the empire in a web of trade. Printing, block printing had been known in China for centuries, but movable type was developed in China during the Song period, roughly 4 centuries before Gutenberg developed it independently in Europe, allowed the reproduction of texts at a scale and cost that had not previously been possible, and books became, for the first time, something that a reasonably prosperous person could accumulate in meaningful numbers, building the kind of private library that had previously been available only to the very wealthy or to institutions. The paintings of the Song period have a quality that is very difficult to describe without experiencing them directly, but the effort is worth making. Song landscape painting, ink on silk or paper, usually in relatively small formats, intended to be held in the hands or unrolled slowly on a table, achieves something that feels, when you encounter it, like a kind of visual equivalent of silence. The mountains in these paintings are enormous and mist-shrouded, their upper reaches dissolving into the pale, unpainted silk, as if they are still in the process of forming, still deciding how solid they wish to be. The trees are small and carefully placed, their ink lines precise in their observation of how a branch bends, how leaves cluster at the tip of a twig. And somewhere in the landscape, tiny, unhurried, easily overlooked, there is often a human figure, a scholar in a small boat, a fisherman on a stone bridge, a walker on a mountain path, dwarfed by the vast, quiet world surrounding him, completely at ease in his smallness, as if he has always known that the mountain does not require his significance in order to be magnificent. This is, in its way, a philosophy rendered in ink and silence, the understanding that the human being is part of the natural world, not its master, not its center, but a small and valued presence within something infinitely larger and older and more patient than any individual life. To sit with a Song painting is to be gently reminded of this, in the way that a river or a mountain reminds you, when you are quiet enough to receive the reminder. The dynasties continued to turn, each one rising and settling and fading in the long, slow rhythm of Chinese history. The Yuan dynasty of the Mongols, which brought China into the largest contiguous empire the world has known, the Ming dynasty with its great ocean-going fleets, and its careful consolidation of Chinese identity after the long Mongol interlude, the Qing dynasty of the Manchu, which would carry imperial China into the modern world, and ultimately, after more than 2.5 centuries, bring the long age of dynasties to its quiet, fading close. But each of these deserves its own unhurried attention, and they will receive it in the chapters that follow, unrolled slowly, like a long silk scroll, in the gentle light of a still afternoon. For now it is enough to rest with this image, a river, wide and patient, carrying its silt toward the sea, Above the river, the sky is the pale blue of early morning, lightening gradually, not yet fully committed to the day. On the bank, a farmer stands in his field, reading the quality of the light, the smell of the air, the behavior of the birds, all the quiet signals that a long life of attention has taught him to read. He does not hurry. There is no need to hurry. The dynasty above him will change, as dynasties always change in the long, slow turning of heaven's mandate. But the river will continue, the silt will settle, the seed will grow, and the farmer will stand in his field in the pale morning light, patient and unhurried, as he has always stood, as his father stood before him, and his father's father before that, all the way back to the first quiet morning when someone knelt beside the yellow river and pressed a seed into the warm, soft, golden earth. There is a particular quality of light in the desert at the end of the day, when the sun has dropped low enough to touch the western horizon, and the sand catches that last warmth and holds it, glowing softly in tones of amber and rose and the faded gold of old cloth. The shadows of the dunes stretch long and gentle across the ground, and the air, which has been hot all day with the dry, pressing heat of an inland desert far from any coast, begins to cool at the edges, a faint breath of something fresher moving in from the east, carrying with it the faint, dusty fragrance of dry grass and stone. In this light, at this hour, the desert does not feel hostile or forbidding. It feels vast and quiet and very old, as if it has been lying here in the sun since long before there were eyes to see it, patient in the way that only truly enormous things can be patient, indifferent in the kindest possible sense of the word. It was through deserts like this one, through the Taklamakan and the Gobi, through the sun-bleached corridors between the Tian Shan Mountains to the north and the Kunlun Mountains to the south, that the great overland trading routes of the ancient world passed, connecting the settled civilizations of China in the east with the civilizations of Central Asia, Persia, the Mediterranean world, and India. We call these routes the Silk Road, a name that was coined not by the merchants who traveled them, but by a 19th-century German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen, who gave the routes their evocative name in 1877. The merchants themselves would not have recognized the term. They would have known only their particular section of the route, the stretch between two oasis towns, the pass through a particular range of mountains, the portion of the desert that took a certain number of days to cross if the camels were well loaded and the weather cooperated. The Silk Road was not, in any case, a single road. It was a shifting, braided network of routes, spreading and contracting over centuries in response to political conditions, the presence or absence of water, the security or insecurity of particular passes and stretches of open ground. Some sections ran along river valleys, following the reliable presence of water through otherwise inhospitable terrain. Others crossed open desert, navigating by the stars at night and by the positioning of distant mountains in the long, clear days. The oasis towns that punctuated the routes were essential stopping places, places where water could be found, where animals could rest and feed, where goods could be traded, where travelers from east and west and north and south gathered in the shaded courtyard spaces of caravanserais and exchanged, along with their goods, their languages, their stories, their religious practices, their musical traditions, their recipes and medicines and methods of farming and weaving and building. The caravanserai deserves a moment of quiet attention, because it is one of those practical structures that also becomes, over time, a kind of symbol. A caravanserai was essentially a large inn built around an open central courtyard, with rooms around the perimeter for travelers and stabling for animals, and a well or cistern at the center providing water. The walls were thick, thick enough to keep out the desert cold at night and the desert heat in the day, and the gateway was large enough for a loaded camel to pass through with its burden intact. Inside, in the courtyard, the sounds of many different languages would have mingled in the evening air, along with the smell of cook fires, animal dung, spices, leather, the particular dusty warm smell of a camel's coat after a long day in the sun. People who had traveled for days or weeks across empty, silent landscape would find themselves suddenly in a small, enclosed world of warmth and activity. A world that felt, after the vast emptiness of the desert, almost impossibly rich and particular. Silk was the commodity that gave these roots their most memorable name, and silk deserves the name. No other material has traveled as far, been as widely desired, or generated as much fascination in cultures far from the place of its making, as silk has done across the long centuries of its history. When Roman traders first encountered Chinese silk, brought westward through the hands of many intermediaries, each taking their portion before passing it on, so that by the time it reached the markets of Rome it had traveled thousands of kilometers through a dozen different hands, they were baffled by its nature. It was clearly a textile, clearly woven, but from what? The fineness of the thread was unlike anything they knew. There are accounts from Roman writers speculating that silk was combed from the leaves of trees, or spun from some kind of fine mineral, or produced in some other way that bore no relation to the actual method, which was carefully guarded as a state secret in China for centuries, the knowledge of sericulture being so valuable that to share it with outsiders was a serious offense. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of China was, at various times, death. The secret was eventually carried westward. Tradition holds that Byzantine monks smuggled silkworm eggs out of China hidden in hollow walking staffs in the 6th century of the Common Era, bringing the knowledge of sericulture to the Byzantine world and eventually to the rest of Europe and the Middle East. Whether or not this particular story is precisely accurate in its details, it captures something true about the nature of knowledge, which is that it moves, inevitably and irresistibly, through the same channels that goods and people move through, and no wall or law or guarded border can, over the long run of time, keep it from spreading wherever human curiosity and human need draw it. But silk was only the most glamorous of the goods that moved along these routes. The actual trade was enormously varied, a slow, continuous exchange of almost everything that could be carried, packed, loaded onto an animal or a cart, transported across difficult terrain, and sold for more than it had cost to acquire. From China went silk, certainly, but also porcelain, the fine, translucent ceramics that Chinese potters had developed to a degree of refinement that potters elsewhere in the world could not match and would not match for many centuries, as well as lacquerware, cast iron, bronze, spices from southern China and Southeast Asia, and tea, which became, over the centuries of the Tang and Song and later dynasties, one of the most important commodities on the routes. Drunk from Central Asia to the Middle East in the forms and customs that the long road had gradually evolved. Moving eastward into China came glass, a material that Chinese craftsmen understood and used, but which they did not produce in the same quantities or qualities as the glassmakers of Syria and Egypt and Persia, along with gold and silver, ivory, cotton textiles, wine and sealed pottery amphorae, horses, and perhaps most consequentially of all, ideas. Buddhism traveled the Silk Road from India into Central Asia, and from Central Asia into China during the Han Dynasty, and the centuries of fragmentation that followed, carried by monks who walked or rode along the same desert paths as the merchants, stopping at the same oasis towns, sleeping under the same vast, star-filled desert skies. The great Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who left Chang'an in 629 of the Common Era and traveled for 17 years across Central Asia and India, gathering Buddhist texts and bringing them home to translate, is one of the most famous travelers of the ancient world, a man who crossed some of the most difficult terrain on earth in pursuit of something that could not be weighed or carried in a saddlebag, something that could only be carried in the mind and the heart. The oasis towns along the Silk Road were places of remarkable cultural layering, places where the art of one tradition gradually absorbed the influences of another, producing something new and composite that belonged fully to neither of its parent traditions but drew from both. Dunhuang, a town at the eastern edge of the Taklamakan Desert in what is now western China's Gansu province, is perhaps the most remarkable example of this layering. Beginning in the 4th century of the Common Era and continuing for roughly 1,000 years, Buddhist monks carved a series of caves into the soft sandstone cliffs near the town, decorating the interior walls and ceilings with paintings and sculptures of extraordinary richness and variety. The earliest caves show the influence of Indian and Central Asian Buddhist art, the figures rounded and warm in a way that reflects the stylistic conventions of the Gandhara region to the west. The later caves show a gradual absorption of Chinese artistic sensibility, the figures becoming more linear, more elongated, more fluid in their postures, the landscapes in the background acquiring the particular quality of Chinese landscape painting with its suggestion of infinite recession into misty distance. To walk through the Dunhuang caves slowly, as they deserve to be walked through, pausing at each entrance to allow the eyes to adjust from the desert brightness outside to the soft dimness within, is to move through 1,000 years of slow cultural conversation, each generation of artists building upon what the previous generation had done, modifying it slightly in response to what they had seen and learned and felt, adding their own layer to the accumulated beauty of the place, the way the river adds its layer of silt to the bank, patient and gradual and quietly transforming. The colors in the older paintings have faded with the centuries, the reds softening to terracotta, the blues becoming the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky, the greens acquiring the dusty quality of old moss. But even faded, they retain something essential, a quality of intention, of care, of the slow investment of many lifetimes in the making of something beautiful enough to offer to the sacred. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had appointed himself guardian of the Dunhuang caves, accidentally discovered a sealed chamber that had been walled up around the year 1000 and forgotten for 9 centuries. Inside, he found approximately 40,000 manuscripts and paintings, packed into the small space with extraordinary care, the accumulated library of a thriving Buddhist center, sealed against some threat that had never materialized, waiting in the dark and the dry desert air for someone to find them. The manuscripts were in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Uyghur, and other languages, a physical record of the multilingual, multicultural world that the Silk Road had created at this particular crossroads. Among them were documents of enormous historical importance, including what is believed to be the world's oldest dated printed book, a copy of the Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 of the Common Era, its pages still clear, its columns of characters still legible after more than 1100 years in the dark. The Great Wall of China, which is perhaps the most immediately recognizable structure associated with China in the imagination of the wider world, is connected to the Silk Road in ways that are not always immediately obvious but which, upon reflection, reveal themselves as both logical and interesting. The wall was not built all at once, and it was not built for a single purpose. It was constructed and reconstructed and extended and modified over many centuries, beginning with earlier walls built by various warring states' kingdoms, and reaching its most elaborate and well-preserved form under the Ming Dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644. In its Ming form, the Great Wall runs for thousands of kilometers across the northern landscape of China, across mountains and along ridge lines, down into valleys and up again, built from stone in the east and from rammed earth in the drier west, wide enough at the top for a road, punctuated by watchtowers at regular intervals, each one positioned so that a fire signal lit in one could be seen from the next. The wall is often presented as a simple barrier, a line drawn between China and the steppe world beyond, but this description does not quite capture its actual character or function. It was not primarily intended to stop large armies. A wall, however impressive, cannot stop a sufficiently determined military force. Its more practical functions were surveillance and communication. The watchtowers allowed the movement of people and animals across the northern frontier to be observed, and the smoke signal system allowed that information to be relayed rapidly eastward to wherever the military authorities were stationed. It was also a statement, a declaration in stone and earth and labor of where the agricultural, settled, text-centered world of China began, and where the nomadic, pastoral world of the steppe ended. This was not a natural border. It was a constructed one, drawn through a landscape that did not itself recognize the distinction, built to make visible a boundary that was, in human terms, constantly being negotiated, crossed, and blurred. The relationship between the settled Chinese world south of the wall and the nomadic peoples north of it is one of the longest, most complex, and most consequential relationships in human history. The nomadic peoples of the steppe, the Xiongnu during the Han period, the Xianbei, the Rouran, the Tuoks, the Khitan, the Jurchen, the Mongols, were not simply threats to be managed or enemies to be repelled. They were neighbors, trading partners, sources of the horses that the Chinese military desperately needed, consumers of the silk and grain that Chinese agriculture produced in abundance. The relationship was frequently difficult, frequently violent, but it was also continuous and mutually dependent in ways that the wall's stark binary, this side, that side, cannot fully express. The porcelain that traveled along the Silk Road alongside the silk is worth pausing on, because porcelain is one of those technical achievements that required, in its development, a combination of knowledge, experimentation, and patient refinement across many generations that is itself a kind of quiet marvel. True porcelain, the hard, translucent, bell-ringing ceramic that rings like a soft bell when you tap it and allows light to pass through its thinnest sections, requires a particular clay, a particular temperature, and a particular firing technique. Chinese potters arrived at all of these through centuries of incremental improvement, each generation of kiln workers building on the accumulated experience of the previous one, testing and adjusting and testing again, developing both the technical knowledge and the aesthetic sensibility to produce objects that were functional and beautiful in equal measure. The glazes developed by Chinese potters during the Tang and Song periods have colors that have become famous in their own right. The pale, mist-gray green of Celadon, which has the quality of still water reflecting a cloudy sky. The deep, rich brown-black of Jian ware, the tea bowls made in Fujian province whose dark glaze sometimes develops. In the firing, patterns of pale streaks and spots that have been compared to hare's fur and to oil droplets on dark water. The creamy, soft white of the finest Tang wares, which catches the light with the particular quality of something that has been made very carefully and has come through the heat of the kiln, having lost nothing essential. These ceramics traveled westward in the holds of ships and on the backs of camels, and when they arrived in Persia and the Arab world and eventually in Europe, they were received with the same baffled admiration that silk had received, a recognition that something very fine had been made by people with knowledge and patience and sensibility, somewhere very far away. The maritime routes of the Silk Road deserve attention here, because the overland routes were not the only paths along which goods and ideas moved between China and the wider world. From the coastal cities of southern China, from the ports of what are now Guangzhou and Quanzhou and Hangzhou, ships had been sailing southward and westward for centuries, following the monsoon winds across the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, stopping at ports along the way, trading their Chinese goods for the spices and aromatics and precious stones of Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the East African coast. These maritime routes were, in some ways, even more important than the overland routes in terms of the sheer volume of goods they carried, because ships can carry far more than any caravan, and the sea, for all its dangers, is in some ways a more reliable highway than the desert. The most dramatic episode in the history of Chinese maritime activity came during the early Ming Dynasty, between 1405 and 1433, when a eunuch admiral named Zheng he commanded a series of enormous treasure fleets that sailed westward from China's southern coast across the Indian Ocean, stopping at ports in Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the East African coast. These fleets were extraordinary in their scale. The largest ships, the so-called treasure ships, are described in historical sources as being several times larger than the Portuguese caravels that would later round the Cape of Good Hope, though the exact dimensions remain a matter of scholarly discussion. The fleets carried Chinese silk and porcelain for trade and as gifts, and they returned with exotic animals, giraffes, zebras, lions, foreign ambassadors, and tribute goods from the many ports they visited. The giraffes deserve a gentle pause, because the image of a giraffe arriving in the imperial capital of Ming China, brought across the Indian Ocean in the hold of a ship, is one of those historical details that lodges itself softly in the mind and does not leave. In Chinese, the giraffe was called qilin, a term already used for a mythical creature of good omen, a gentle beast associated with the reign of benevolent rulers. To see an actual giraffe, tall, spotted, improbably long-necked, moving with its peculiar, slow, rocking grace, and to recognize in it the benign strangeness of the qilin was to feel that the world was confirming, in the most literal and physical way possible, that the Ming Emperor's rule was indeed virtuous and blessed. The giraffe walked through the imperial courtyards under the pale sky of northern China, and the court officials and palace residents watched it with the quiet, wondering attention one gives to something that is both real and dreamlike at once. The Silk Road, whether overland or maritime, was, at its deepest level, not really about silk or porcelain or spices, or any of the specific goods that moved along it. It was about the human tendency to want what others have made, to be curious about how others live, to find in the unfamiliar something that enriches and extends the familiar. A merchant carrying a bolt of Chinese silk westward toward the markets of Samarkand or Constantinople was not only carrying a textile. He was carrying the accumulated knowledge of the sericulturalists who had tended the mulberry trees and the silkworms, the weavers who had drawn the thread onto the loom, the dyers who had given the cloth its color, whether the deep red of madder or the blue of indigo or the particular golden yellow that only comes from a specific kind of lichen. He was carrying, folded into the soft, luminous fabric, a portion of the patient, careful, slowly accumulated civilization that had produced it. And the merchant traveling eastward, bringing his glass or his spices or his horses into China, was carrying in his cargo not only physical objects but the traces of another way of being in the world, another set of answers to the questions that all human beings everywhere have always been asking. How should we live? What is beautiful? What is sacred? What is worth carrying across a desert, over a mountain, across an ocean, to share with people on the other side of the world? The answer, it seems, is almost everything. The long road was always open in both directions to anyone patient enough and curious enough to walk it. The stone of the Great Wall still stands in many places, though in others it has crumbled back into the earth from which it was made, its precise lines softening into a gentle ridge, grass growing from the mortar, wildflowers in the crevices. In the early morning, when the mist is still lying in the valleys below, and the mountains are visible only as darker shapes within the pale gray air, the wall has a quality of something half dissolved back into the landscape, something that was once sharply defined and has been slowly, gently returning to the more ambiguous state of things. This is not a sad image. It is a peaceful one. The stone has done its work. The road has carried its goods and its ideas and its quiet human curiosity in both directions for long enough that the boundary it marked has lost some of its urgency. The world has moved through it and around it and over it, the way water moves through any obstacle, patient, persistent, and ultimately, over the long run of time, unstoppable. And somewhere in the desert, where the light is still that soft, fading gold of late afternoon, a camel stands in the long shadow of a dune, patient and still, chewing slowly, waiting for the signal to rise and move again. The load on its back is heavy but balanced. The road ahead is long but familiar, and the sky above, enormous and pale and full of the quiet light of a day that is not quite done, stretches in every direction without any visible end. There is a kind of knowing that does not come from reading or from being told, but from sitting quietly with something long enough that it begins, gradually and without announcement, to reveal itself. The Chinese philosophical tradition has always understood this kind of knowing, has always held it in particular regard, giving it names and forms and careful attention across thousands of years of thought and practice. To sit with a landscape until the landscape becomes part of you. To read a text so many times that the words dissolve into something beyond words. To practice a brushstroke so repeatedly, so patiently, that the brush eventually moves without the intervention of conscious intention, the hand knowing what to do before the mind has formulated the instruction. This is the art of stillness, and it runs through the inner life of Chinese civilization like a thread of silk through dark fabric, quiet, continuous, luminous when the light catches it. The inner life of a civilization is harder to trace than its outer life. Walls and tombs and bronze vessels can be excavated and measured and dated. The state of mind of a poet sitting in a garden in the Tang dynasty, watching the moon rise above a bamboo grove, cannot be excavated, only approached slowly, gently, through the words that the poet left behind, words which have themselves traveled through many centuries and many hands before arriving in this moment, in this quiet, in whatever light is falling now through whatever window you are reading by. But the approaching is worth doing, because what you find when you sit with these words long enough is something that feels surprisingly close and familiar. The same quality of human attention, the same quiet noticing of the world that you might find in your own best moments of stillness. Philosophy in China did not begin in academies or with written texts. It began, as all philosophy begins, with people sitting with questions that the ordinary business of daily life could not fully answer. Why do things change? What is the proper way to live? What is the relationship between the individual human life and the vast, indifferent, beautiful world that surrounds it? These questions were being asked along the banks of the Yellow River, in the same period that they were being asked along the banks of the Ganges in India and in the city-states of ancient Greece. A coincidence of timing so remarkable that the philosopher Karl Jaspers in the 20th century gave it a name: the axial age, the period between roughly 800 and 200 before the Common Era, when something shifted in human consciousness across several different cultures simultaneously, and the great philosophical and religious traditions that still shape human life today began to take form. In China, the most important voice of this axial moment, the voice that would resonate most persistently across the longest span of subsequent history, was the voice of Confucius, whom we met briefly in the previous chapter and who deserves, here in the chapter devoted to the inner life of Chinese civilization, a longer and more leisurely acquaintance. Confucius was born in 551 before the Common Era in the small state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province, into a family of minor nobility that had seen better days. A family with the traditions and aspirations of the aristocratic class, but without the resources to match them. This particular social position, educated, cultured, aware of how things ought to be, but without the material circumstances to make them so, gave Confucius a perspective that would prove enormously generative. He cared deeply about proper form, about the rituals and relationships that he believed held society together, precisely because he had seen what happened when those forms were neglected, when the social fabric frayed. The concept that sits at the center of Confucian thought is Ren, a word that is typically translated as benevolence, or humaneness, or human-heartedness, none of which quite captures the full resonance of the Chinese term, which carries within it the sense of the warmth and care that flows naturally between people who are paying proper attention to each other, who are treating each other as fully human, who are responding to the other's humanity with their own. Ren is not an abstract principle. It is a quality that shows itself in specific actions, in specific relationships, in the daily, practical texture of how people treat one another. To practice, Ren is to be genuinely present with the people in front of you, not merely going through the outward forms of courtesy and consideration, but actually feeling the consideration, actually attending to the other person with the quality of attention that their humanity deserves. This distinction between outward form and inner reality is one that Confucius returned to repeatedly in the conversations recorded in the Analects, and it is a distinction that gives his thought its particular ethical seriousness. The rituals of Zhou society, the ceremonies of ancestor veneration, the formal procedures of court life, the specific gestures and words associated with different social occasions, were important to Confucius, but they were important as expressions of something real, not as substitutes for it. A ritual performed without the appropriate inner feeling was, for Confucius, worse than useless. It was a kind of lie, a performance of relationship where no real relationship existed. The music played at a ceremony had to be played with genuine feeling, or it failed in its essential purpose, which was not merely to make sound, but to harmonize the inner states of the participants with the proper feelings appropriate to the occasion. Resting alongside Confucianism in the great philosophical landscape of ancient China is a tradition that approaches the same fundamental questions from a very different direction, arriving at answers that seem, at first, almost opposite to the Confucian ones, and yet which, in the long view of Chinese intellectual history, have coexisted with Confucianism in a relationship of complementary tension, the way the darkness and light of a landscape painting define each other, each making the other more visible, each incomplete without the other. This tradition is Taoism, the way of the Tao, and its founding text is a short, quiet, densely layered work called the Tao Te Ching, attributed to a figure named Laozi, which means simply old master, about whose historical existence there is considerable uncertainty, but whose words have been read and reread and contemplated for 2,500 years. The Tao, the way, is, in the Tao Te Ching, the fundamental principle underlying all of existence, the deep pattern or current of the universe that gives rise to everything and to which everything returns. It cannot be fully named or described, because the moment you name it, you have already limited it, and the Tao is by its nature beyond all limitation. The very first lines of the Tao Te Ching announce this clearly. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. This is not a frustration or a failure. It is an invitation to a different mode of knowing, a knowing through direct experience rather than through description, through stillness rather than through analysis, through yielding rather than through grasping. The concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, or effortless action, or action in accordance with the natural flow of things, is central to Taoist practice and Taoist understanding of the good life. Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing. It means not doing anything that runs against the natural grain of things, not forcing, not straining, not imposing one's will on a situation that has its own momentum and its own direction. The image used repeatedly in the Tao Te Ching is water. Water does not force. Water does not insist. Water finds the lowest place, the path of least resistance, and follows it, and in following it, water over time shapes stone, carves canyons, fills the deepest and most hidden places. The Tao Te Ching suggests that the wise person is like water, soft, yielding, unhurried, finding the natural course and following it, and thereby, over the long and patient run of time, accomplishing everything. The image of water is worth holding in the mind for a moment, in the slow way that this kind of image deserves. Think of a small stream running over stones. The stream does not choose its path in the way that a person chooses a road. It does not deliberate or plan. It simply moves in the direction that the landscape offers, finding the low places, following the slight tilt of the ground, gathering other small streams as it goes, growing gradually wider and slower as the terrain flattens. And yet the stream, given enough time, shapes the landscape as much as the landscape shapes the stream. The stones in its bed worn smooth and round by the patient passage of water, the banks cut and shaped and overgrown with the particular plants that like their feet wet, the whole valley carved, over geological time, by the quiet insistence of water finding its way. Alongside Confucianism and Taoism, A third great tradition contributed to the inner life of Chinese civilization: Buddhism, which arrived in China from India along the Silk Road routes during the Han Dynasty and gradually, over several centuries, absorbed itself into the Chinese cultural landscape with a thoroughness and a subtlety that is itself a kind of illustration of the concept of Wu Wei. Buddhism did not arrive in China and immediately displace what was already there. It arrived, and it settled, and it found the places where it fit, where its questions complemented the questions already being asked, where its practices resonated with practices already in place, where its images and stories could be translated, sometimes literally and sometimes more freely, into forms that the Chinese cultural imagination could receive and make its own. And in that settling over many generations, Buddhism changed, becoming something distinctly Chinese while remaining recognizably Buddhist. The way a river changes as it moves through different landscapes, acquiring the particular color of the local soil, the particular quality of light that the surrounding trees cast upon it, without ceasing to be, fundamentally and continuously, a river. Chan Buddhism, known in Japan as Zen, the form in which it became most familiar to the wider world, is perhaps the most distinctively Chinese development within the Buddhist tradition, a form of practice that emphasizes direct experience over doctrinal learning, meditative sitting over ritual ceremony, the sudden or gradual awakening that comes from sustained, patient attention to the present moment over the accumulation of scholarly knowledge. Chan masters taught through paradox and through the unexpected, using stories and encounters designed to jolt the student's mind out of its habitual patterns of thinking into a more direct, more immediate contact with the nature of things. The koan, a paradoxical question or statement given to a student as an object of meditation, has the quality of a pebble dropped into still water, creating rings that spread outward and disrupt the surface, until the surface, eventually, is still again, though a different stillness than before. The arts that developed within and around these philosophical traditions carry their influence in the most direct and physical way, in the specific quality of attention that a Song dynasty landscape painting asks of its viewer, in the particular way a Chinese garden is designed to create an experience of moving through a landscape that is both intimate and vast, in the sound of the gyukin, the ancient seven-stringed zither, which has been played in China for at least 3,000 years, and which produces a sound of such quiet, resonant, unhurried beauty that to hear it in the right circumstances is to feel the ordinary world step back a little, making room for something more essential. The gyukin is an instrument that rewards patience, both in the learning and in the listening. Its strings are of silk, or in more recent times of nylon or metal wound with nylon, and they respond to the touch with a sensitivity that means the player's whole body must be calm and centered before the instrument will produce its best sound. The playing positions are elaborate and precise, each note produced by a specific combination of the plucking finger, the stopping finger, and the arm position, a vocabulary of gesture as detailed and as meaningful as the vocabulary of words in a classical Chinese text. The great gyukin players of Chinese history were scholars and philosophers as well as musicians, men for whom playing the instrument was not a performance but a practice, a way of cultivating and expressing the inner qualities that philosophy sought to develop. The Chinese garden is another form in which the philosophical understanding of the relationship between the human and the natural world finds its most physical and inhabitable expression. The classical gardens of Suzhou, a city in Jiangsu province that has been called the Venice of China for its network of canals and its extraordinary concentration of classical gardens within a relatively small area, are among the most carefully considered and most quietly beautiful spaces that human beings have made anywhere in the world. They are not large, most of them, by the standards of the great European gardens of Versailles or Stowe. They are intimate, almost domestic in scale, designed to be experienced slowly, on foot, moving through a series of carefully arranged views that unfold one after another like the pages of a book, each one complete in itself and also part of a larger, coherent whole. The principles that govern the design of a classical Chinese garden are essentially the principles of Taoist and Buddhist aesthetics applied to three-dimensional space. Nothing is symmetrical, because the natural world is not symmetrical. Nothing is ostentatiously large, because scale in the natural world is relative, and the illusion of vastness can be created within a small space if the elements are properly arranged. Rocks, particularly the perforated, eroded limestone rocks known as Tehu stones, quarried from the bed of Lake Tai near Suzhou, are placed with great care, their forms suggestive of mountains, of clouds, of the strange, eroded shapes that water makes in stone over very long periods of time. Water is always present, in ponds or channels or small, still basins, reflecting the sky and the rocks and the gnarled branches of the trees above it. And the trees themselves, pine, bamboo, plum, are chosen for their seasonal qualities, their symbolic associations, the particular quality of their silhouette against a pale sky. To walk through a classical Suzhou garden in the early morning, when the air is still cool and the light is coming in low and golden through the latticed windows of the covered walkways, and the sound of water is audible from somewhere nearby, is to understand, in a physical and immediate way, what the Chinese philosophical tradition means by harmony. Not the imposed, symmetrical harmony of matching pairs and perfect geometry, but the more complex, more subtle harmony that comes from many different elements: stone, water, plant, light, sound, space, arranged in a relationship that feels inevitable, as if they could not be other than they are, as if they have been in this relationship for a very long time and have settled into it the way old things settle, the way a stone settles into the bed of a stream, finding its resting place not through force, but through the patient work of finding where it fits. The poetry of the Tang dynasty, often regarded as the high point of classical Chinese poetry, a moment of such concentrated lyric achievement that it has served as the standard and the touchstone for Chinese poets in every subsequent century, is saturated with this same quality of attention to the natural world, this same patient noticing of the quality of light, of the behavior of water, of the particular feeling of a specific moment in a specific place. The great Tang poets Du Fu, Li Bai, Wang Wei, Bai Juyi, among many others, wrote with an economy and a precision that is, in some ways, the opposite of prolixity, and yet achieves, through its very concision, an effect of great depth and resonance, the way a very clear, very still pool can appear much deeper than it actually is. Wang Wei, who lived from 699 to 759 of the Common Era, was a poet and a painter and a devout Buddhist, and in his work these three vocations are so fully integrated that it becomes difficult to say where one ends and another begins. He maintained an estate in the hills south of the Tang capital, a place called Wangchuan, which he depicted both in a long series of landscape paintings and in a series of poems describing the individual scenes of the estate. A bamboo grove, a deer park, a magnolia garden, a lake shore at dawn. The poems are short, often only 8 or 12 lines, and they describe their subjects with a stillness and a directness that feels, when you read them, less like description and more like the thing itself. The bamboo in the bamboo, the dawn light in the dawn light. Wang Wei's contemporary critics and readers recognized something in his work that they described as having poems within the paintings and paintings within the poems, a quality of mutual interpenetration between the visual and the verbal that reflects the deeper understanding, in the Chinese aesthetic tradition, that all art forms are drawing from the same source, expressing, in their different media, the same fundamental quality of attentive presence. Li Bai, sometimes spelled Li Bo, was Wang Wei's near contemporary, and in many ways his temperamental opposite. Where Wang Wei was quiet, studious, and devotional, Li Bai was exuberant, fond of wine, given to wandering, writing poems of sudden, sweeping beauty that seemed to arrive from nowhere and depart just as quickly, leaving behind them a feeling of something large and bright and slightly intoxicating. Li Bai is associated, in Chinese cultural memory, with the moon, which appears in his poems more often than in those of any other classical Chinese poet, sometimes as a companion in solitude, sometimes as a mirror for his feelings, sometimes simply as the moon itself, hanging in the dark sky above the river with its own silent, luminous composure. One of his most beloved short poems describes waking in the night and seeing moonlight on the floor of the room and mistaking it, in the first moment of waking, for frost, and then looking up and seeing the moon and thinking of his distant home. The poem is only 20 characters in the original Chinese, and it has been memorized by Chinese schoolchildren for more than 1,000 years. Du Fu, who is often paired with Li Bai as the two greatest poets of the Tang, and indeed of all Chinese literary history, wrote with a weight and a moral seriousness that Li Bai's work does not always carry, a deep concern for human suffering, for the effects of war and displacement and political failure on ordinary lives, a sense that the poet's attention is owed not only to the moon and the river and the mountain, but also to the people sleeping cold and hungry in the houses below the mountain. The soldiers far from home, the refugees on the road. Du Fu lived through the Lushan Rebellion, a devastating civil conflict that began in 755 and caused enormous suffering across the Tang Empire, displacing populations, destroying cities, reducing a prosperous and confident civilization to something frightened and diminished for a period of years. His poems from this period are among the most deeply human documents in the Chinese literary tradition, careful, sorrowful observations of a world that has come apart, written with the steadiness of a man who has decided that bearing witness is itself a form of care. The calligraphy of the Chinese tradition deserves its own quiet paragraph here, because calligraphy in China has always occupied a position that Western traditions have generally not given to the art of writing. It has been understood as one of the highest of the visual arts, an art form in which the quality of a person's character and cultivation is directly visible in the quality of their brushwork, just as the quality of a musician's inner state is audible in the quality of their playing. The brush loaded with ink, the blank sheet of paper or silk, the moment before the first stroke, this moment has been described by Chinese calligraphers as requiring a particular kind of inner stillness, a settling of the breath and the mind into a state of quiet readiness, before the brush can produce its best mark. The stroke itself must be made with commitment. Hesitation shows in the line as a kind of weakness, a wavering, but it must also be made without force, without the kind of effortful pushing that tightens the shoulder and stiffens the wrist and takes the suppleness out of the mark. It must be, in the Taoist sense, effortful and effortless at the same time, committed and relaxed, present and unhurried. The examination system that the Han dynasty established, and the Tang and Song dynasties elaborated into its most developed form, was, in a very direct sense, the institutional expression of these philosophical values. The belief that the qualities of character and learning that produced good governance were the same qualities that produced good writing, good poetry, good music, good calligraphy. To pass the imperial examinations, a candidate had to demonstrate not only knowledge of the Confucian classics and the historical texts, but also the ability to compose poetry and essays in the classical style, the ability to bring learning and feeling, and the precise control of language together into something that was both correct and alive. The examinations were extraordinarily demanding, requiring years of preparation, and most candidates failed them. But the ideal they represented, the idea that those who governed should be those who had cultivated themselves most thoroughly in the arts of mind and spirit, was one of the most distinctive and most durable ideas in Chinese political culture. The emperors themselves, at their best, embodied this ideal, or aspired to embody it, which in a culture that values aspiration toward ideals may amount to the same thing. The Emperor Huizong of the Song dynasty, who reigned in the early 12th century, is one of the most poignant figures in Chinese imperial history. A man of extraordinary artistic gifts, his paintings of birds and flowers are considered among the masterpieces of Chinese art, their observations so precise and their brushwork so refined that scholars have spent centuries studying them. Who was also, as an emperor, a political and military failure, presiding over the loss of northern China to the Jurchen Jin dynasty, and dying in captivity far from his capital. Huizong's paintings have the quality of things made by someone who sees the world with unusual clarity and love. The feathers of a bird, rendered with the same careful attention that a botanist might give to the structure of a plant, but with something more than botanical accuracy, something that can only be called tenderness, a quality of feeling for the particular life of the particular creature being observed. To look at a Huizong bird painting is to be in the presence of attention at its most refined, attention so patient and so full that it almost becomes a form of love. The bird is simply there, perched on a branch or poised for flight, its weight exactly right, its eye alive, the specific quality of its feathers, their texture, their particular way of catching the light, rendered with a fidelity that comes not from mechanical observation, but from something deeper, from the kind of looking that transforms the looker as well as the looked at. This quality of attention is what the Chinese philosophical and aesthetic tradition has always been pointing toward, through its many different forms and voices and centuries. The capacity to be fully present with the world as it actually is, to receive it without distortion or imposition, to find in the particular, the specific bird on the specific branch in the specific light of a specific afternoon, the quality of the universal, the deep, quiet, still truth of things. The afternoon light is fading now, moving through the color of old honey into the softer, cooler tone of early evening. In a garden somewhere in Suzhou, the water in the pond has taken on the color of the sky, pale and slightly violet at the edges, darker toward the center where the reflections of the rocks and trees deepen into something almost black. A single fish moves below the surface, visible for a moment as a flash of orange and gold, then gone, back into the dark water. The bamboo at the edge of the garden makes a small sound in the slight evening breeze, a dry, papery whisper, barely audible, the sound of something that is entirely comfortable in its own nature, that requires nothing more than what it already is. Somewhere nearby, in a room where the lamp is not yet lit, a scholar is sitting with a book open on the table before him. He is not reading. He has been reading for a long time, and now he is simply sitting, allowing what he has read to settle into him the way the evening light settles into the garden, gradually, without announcement, becoming part of the quality of the moment. The book is old. The words in it are older still, written by a man who sat in a similar room in a similar evening light a very long time ago, asking the same questions that the scholar is asking now, arriving at answers that were not final but were sufficient, sufficient to live by, sufficient to offer to the next person who sat down in the quiet with the question and the light and the sound of bamboo in the evening air. This is the gift that the philosophers and the poets and the painters and the calligraphers of China have been passing forward across the centuries. Not answers exactly, but the quality of attention that makes the right questions possible. The art of stillness, practiced for so long by so many patient hands. There is a moment that comes in the very late afternoon, in the final hour before the sun touches the horizon, when the light seems to pause. It does not actually pause, light does not pause, the earth does not stop its slow turning. But there is a quality to that particular hour that feels suspended, held, as if the day has gathered itself into a single long breath before the gradual exhale of evening. The shadows are at their longest. The colors are at their warmest. The air, which has been moving all day, sometimes settles into an unusual stillness. And in that stillness, you can hear things that the busier hours of the day had covered over. The distant sound of water, the particular quality of silence that lies beneath all sound, the slow, continuous breathing of the world. This quality of suspended light, of a long day reaching its final hour, is not a bad way to think about the China of the late imperial period. The China of the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the Qing dynasty ruled from Beijing over the largest and most populous empire in the world, when the imperial examination system was still functioning, when the Forbidden City still housed the Son of Heaven behind its high vermilion walls, when the great traditions of poetry and painting and calligraphy and garden-making were still being practiced and refined, and when, at the same time, something was changing in the wider world that would, slowly and then more rapidly, alter the conditions of Chinese life in ways that no dynasty and no philosophical tradition had yet had to reckon with. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, was a Manchu dynasty, established by a people from the northeast, from the forested and grassland world beyond the Great Wall, who had swept southward through the disorder that accompanied the collapse of the Ming and established themselves as the new holders of the mandate of heaven. The Manchu rulers of the Qing were, in many ways, extraordinarily thorough in their adoption of Chinese imperial culture. They learned classical Chinese. They patronized Chinese art and literature. They performed the Confucian rituals of the imperial court with the same careful attention to proper form that had always been required of the Son of Heaven. And yet they also maintained their own distinct Manchu identity, their own language, their own traditions, their own banner system of military and social organization. The Qing court was, in this sense, a composite world, Chinese and Manchu woven together in a relationship that was sometimes harmonious and sometimes subtly tense, each informing and modifying the other in the gradual, patient way of things that share a space for a very long time. The 18th century was, in many respects, a period of remarkable stability and prosperity for Qing China. The Qianlong Emperor, who reigned for 60 years from 1735 to 1796, abdicating in that year out of filial respect for his grandfather, the Kangxi Emperor, unwilling to reign longer than that revered predecessor, presided over an empire of enormous extent and considerable internal coherence. The population of China during the Qing period grew dramatically, supported by the introduction of new crops from the Americas, sweet potatoes, maize, peanuts, that could be cultivated on land previously considered too marginal or too hilly for traditional Chinese agriculture, feeding more people from the same amount of land, allowing the gradual extension of cultivation into upland regions that had previously been forested or lightly grazed. This growth was, in a sense, an achievement, a testimony to the productive capacity of the Chinese agricultural system and the adaptive ingenuity of the farming population. But it was also, gradually and quietly, a source of pressure: more people on the same land, more demands on the same resources, the cushion of surplus slowly narrowing as the population continued its patient, steady expansion. The Qianlong Emperor was himself a person of considerable cultural accomplishment, a prolific poet who is said to have written more than 40,000 poems over the course of his long life, a calligrapher, a patron of art and scholarship on an enormous scale. He commissioned the compilation of the Siku Quanchu, the complete library of the four treasuries, an encyclopedic collection of thousands of texts from across the Chinese literary tradition, copied out by hand by armies of scholars, and housed in 7 specially constructed repositories across the empire. The Siku Quanchu was a monument to the depth and breadth of Chinese literary culture, an attempt to gather everything that had been written and thought and felt across thousands of years into a single, ordered, accessible whole. It was also, in its way, an act of conservation, a recognition that the tradition was something worth preserving, something whose full extent even a lifetime of reading could not exhaust. And yet, as the Qianlong Emperor was composing his poems and commissioning his encyclopedia, the world beyond China's borders was changing in ways that would, over the following century, transform the conditions of Chinese life more completely than anything that had happened in the previous 2,000 years of imperial history. In Europe, the Industrial Revolution was beginning its slow, irreversible transformation of manufacturing, transportation, and military capability. Steam engines were being applied to factories, and then to ships, and then to railways. Iron and then steel were being produced in quantities, and at costs that had not previously been conceivable. Weapons were improving in range, accuracy, and rate of fire with a speed that compressed into decades the kind of technological development that had previously taken centuries. And the European powers, Britain foremost among them, but also France, the Netherlands, Portugal, and eventually others, were expanding their commercial and political reach into Asia, Africa, and the Americas with an increasing confidence born of this accumulating technological advantage. The first significant collision between the Qing Empire and the expanding commercial ambitions of the European powers came in the form of trade, specifically, in the form of a trade imbalance that the British East India Company found deeply frustrating. China produced things that Europe wanted: silk, porcelain, tea. But China, in the view of the Qing court, needed nothing that Europe produced, and this assessment was not, at the time, entirely wrong. The Qianlong Emperor's famous reply to the British King George III's trade mission of 1793, led by Lord Macartney, has been quoted and analyzed many times since, and whatever its precise wording, it has come down to us through translations that may not perfectly capture the original. It conveyed with unmistakable clarity the Qing court's sense that China was a complete world, that its civilization lacked nothing that the barbarian West could offer, that trade on terms different from the existing system of tribute and regulated commerce at Canton was neither necessary nor desirable. This was not mere arrogance, though it has sometimes been characterized as such in retrospect. It was a position formed by a very long experience of being, by most of the measures that the Chinese tradition recognized, the most sophisticated and most productive civilization in the world. For most of recorded history, this assessment had been accurate. China had been, for long stretches of the past 2 millennia, the world's largest economy, its most productive agricultural system, the source of technological innovations, paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, that had changed the world in ways whose full effects were felt most dramatically not in China itself, but in the cultures that received and adapted these innovations. The Qing court's confidence in the self-sufficiency of Chinese civilization was grounded in a history that genuinely supported it. What the Qing court could not yet see, in 1793, was that the rate of change in Europe had accelerated to a point where the historical record was no longer a reliable guide to the present balance of capabilities. The mechanism that the British ultimately used to resolve the trade imbalance, to find something that China would accept in exchange for its silk and tea and porcelain, was opium, grown in British India and smuggled into China in quantities that grew steadily through the early 19th century, creating in the process an expanding population of addicted users and draining from China the silver that had previously flowed in. The Qing government's efforts to stop the opium trade led, in 1839, to the destruction of a large quantity of British opium stocks by the Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu. A decisive act, taken after careful deliberation, by a man who understood the damage that opium was doing to Chinese society, and who believed that the law, applied firmly and without exception, was the appropriate remedy. The British government's response was military, and it was swift and overwhelming in a way that revealed, with sudden and painful clarity, the gap that had opened between Chinese and European military technology. The Opium War of 1839 to 1842 and the Treaty of Nanjing that ended it introduced into Chinese life a set of conditions that Chinese historical memory has since described as the century of humiliation. A century in which China was compelled, through military defeat or the credible threat of it, to sign a series of unequal treaties that ceded territory, granted extraterritorial rights to foreign nationals on Chinese soil, opened ports to foreign trade on terms that China had not chosen, and imposed indemnities that placed substantial burdens on the Qing treasury. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. Treaty ports were opened along the coast. Foreign missionaries traveled the interior. Foreign goods flowed in through the newly opened ports, competing with Chinese manufacturers on terms that Chinese producers had not chosen and could not control. The texture of these changes was not felt all at once, and it was not felt equally everywhere. In the great coastal cities, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Tianjin, the presence of the foreign concessions, the foreign banks, the foreign warehouses and churches and newspapers was immediate and visible, a daily reminder of the altered conditions of Chinese life. In the interior, in the farming villages of the Great Plains and the upland regions and the distant southwest, the changes arrived more slowly, filtering in through the price of goods, the arrival of new crops and new techniques, the occasional presence of a missionary school or a new kind of medicine. The world was changing, but the change, like all truly large changes, moved at different speeds in different places, arriving first where the channels of contact were widest and most open, reaching the quieter, more sheltered places only gradually. The way a tide rises slowly at first, then more completely, finding even the most sheltered inlets in its own time. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which convulsed southern and central China between 1850 and 1864, was one of the most devastating conflicts in all of Chinese history and in the history of the world. It began with a man named Hong Ziyuquan, who had encountered Christian missionary literature, and who, after a period of illness and visionary experience, came to believe that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, called to establish a heavenly kingdom on earth and to overthrow the Qing dynasty, which he identified with the forces of darkness. What began as a local religious movement in Guangdong province grew, with extraordinary speed, into a military force that swept northward through central China, capturing Nanjing in 1853 and holding it as the capital of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom for more than a decade. The death toll from the Taiping conflict and its associated famines and disruptions is estimated in the tens of millions, a number so large that it resists full comprehension, and so it is perhaps best understood slowly, at the level of the individual village and the individual family, the particular fields left untended, the particular houses abandoned, the particular silences where there had previously been the ordinary sounds of daily life. The Qing dynasty survived the Taiping conflict and survived subsequent challenges: the Second Opium War, the Sino-French War, the devastating loss to Japan in 1895, the Boxer Rebellion and the foreign intervention that followed it in 1900. But it survived these challenges in a progressively more weakened and constrained condition, like a very old tree that continues to stand but has been hollowed at the center. Its outer form still imposing, but its inner structure no longer what it was. The reforms that various Qing officials, and eventually the Qing court itself, attempted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reforms in the military, in education, in governance, came too late and went too far in some directions and not far enough in others, and the social and intellectual world of China in the first decade of the 20th century was one in which the old certainties had been questioned, and the new certainties had not yet fully formed. And thoughtful people sat with the gap between them in the particular, uncomfortable, generative way that people sit with gaps, not knowing quite what to do, but aware that something must eventually be done. The fall of the Qing dynasty came in 1912, not with a dramatic moment of violent overthrow, but with the quiet, almost anticlimactic abdication of the last emperor, a child named Puyi who was 6 years old when he ascended the throne, and not yet 7 when he signed the documents of abdication in the cold of a February morning in the Forbidden City, the vast, still courtyards of the palace empty and silent around him, the red walls and golden roofs the same as they had always been, the world outside them irrevocably altered. Puyi would remain in the Forbidden City for more than a decade after his abdication, living in the inner courts, attended by the remaining eunuchs and palace staff, the last inhabitant of a world that had already, in all the ways that mattered, come to an end. The Republic of China that succeeded the Qing was, for much of its existence, a nation in search of itself, a political form borrowed from elsewhere, applied to a vast and ancient and internally various country that had no established tradition of republican governance, and asked to function in conditions of extreme external pressure and internal fragmentation. The warlord period of the 1910s and 1920s, during which military strongmen controlled different regions of the country, with little reference to the nominal national government, was a time of considerable suffering and confusion, a time in which the question of what China was and what it should become was answered differently in different places and by different voices, and no single answer had yet accumulated enough authority to quiet the others. And yet, from this period of confusion and searching, came something of remarkable cultural vitality. The May 4th movement of 1919, named for the date of a large protest in Beijing against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had awarded German concessions in Shandong to Japan rather than returning them to China, was also a broader cultural and intellectual movement that challenged the traditional Confucian values and literary forms in favor of new, vernacular literature, new scientific thinking, new political ideas drawn from a wide range of foreign sources. Young writers began writing in the spoken language of everyday life, rather than the formal classical Chinese that had been the medium of educated discourse for centuries, making literature accessible to a far wider readership. New magazines and journals carried essays and stories and poems that spoke to the experience of people living through a period of rapid and disorienting change, searching for languages adequate to what they were feeling. Lu Xun, who is often considered the founding figure of modern Chinese literature, wrote stories of devastating clarity and quiet sorrow about the condition of Chinese society in the early 20th century, about the ways in which tradition could calcify into something life-denying, about the particular loneliness of the person who has seen through the comfortable fictions of the old order, but has not yet found anything solid to put in their place. His most famous story, The True Story of A.Q., traces the life of a poor, self-deceiving village man with a gentle and merciless precision that is, in its own way, an act of love, the love that comes from paying full and honest attention to something, refusing the comfort of flattering distortion, trusting that the truth, however uncomfortable, is more valuable than any reassuring lie. The decades that followed the May 4th movement brought China through experiences of tremendous weight and difficulty. The Northern Expedition that reunified much of the country under the nationalist government in the late 1920s, the long and devastating war with Japan that began in 1937 and merged into the broader catastrophe of the Second World War, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists that resumed after Japan's defeat and concluded in 1949 with the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong, while the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. Each of these periods contains within it a weight of human experience, of loss, of endurance, of the particular courage that ordinary life requires when the conditions of ordinary life have become extraordinary. That deserves its own slow, careful, unhurried attention. The People's Republic of China, founded in October 1949, when Mao Zedong stood on the gate of heavenly peace in Beijing, and proclaimed the establishment of the new state to the assembled crowd in the square below, began its existence in a condition of enormous challenge and enormous aspiration simultaneously. The challenges were the challenges of a country that had been through more than a century of war and instability and external pressure. A country whose infrastructure had been damaged, whose institutions were new and untested, whose population was overwhelmingly rural and largely without formal education. The aspirations were the aspirations of a revolutionary movement that believed, with the particular conviction that comes from having sacrificed enormously for a cause, that a new world was possible, that the old structures of privilege and exploitation could be dismantled and replaced with something more just and more equitable. The reforms of the early People's Republic, land redistribution, the expansion of education and healthcare into rural areas that had previously had little access to either, the mobilization of women into public life and the workforce, brought real improvements to the lives of many people who had previously been among the most disadvantaged in Chinese society. But the same period also brought campaigns of political suppression, the silencing of voices that dissented from the party line, the particular suffering that comes from living in a world where the expression of doubt or disagreement carries serious consequences. The Hundred Flowers campaign of 1956 and 1957, which briefly encouraged open criticism of the party before abruptly reversing course and punishing many of those who had spoken, was one of the more painful illustrations of this pattern. A moment of apparent openness that revealed, in its closing, the limits of what openness was permitted to mean. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, was an attempt to accelerate China's industrialization and agricultural transformation through the mobilization of enormous collective effort, the establishment of people's communes, the setting of production targets that were, in many cases, far beyond what the actual conditions of agriculture and manufacture could support, the diversion of labor from food production into the production of steel in small backyard furnaces that turned out, in most cases, to be producing metal of insufficient quality for industrial use. The famine that resulted from the disruption of agricultural production and the misreporting of harvests that prevented an adequate response to the emerging crisis caused the deaths of many millions of people. The numbers are still debated by historians, but they are very large, and they belong to the category of historical events that can only be properly held in the mind slowly, and with great gentleness, and with a full acknowledgement that behind every number there is a particular life, a particular family, a particular village where the sound of daily life grew quieter, and then quieter still. The Cultural Revolution, which Mao launched in 1966 and which continued in various forms until his death in 1976, was a period of intense and painful disruption to Chinese intellectual and cultural life. A decade in which teachers and scholars and artists and officials were attacked, humiliated, sent to the countryside for re-education, their books burned, their work condemned. The accumulated achievements of Chinese cultural life, subjected to a revolutionary iconoclasm that was, in its own way, a kind of violence against the long, patient, accumulated tradition that this documentary has been quietly describing. And yet, even through this period of disruption, life continued, quietly, in the spaces that disruption always leaves open, in the continued turning of the seasons, the continued growing of grain, the continued private devotion to things that mattered and that no campaign could entirely reach. The reforms that followed Mao's death and the rise to prominence of Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s brought China into a period of transformation so rapid and so thorough that it has been described as one of the most dramatic economic developments in human history. Though here, as always, the word dramatic should be understood in its quieter sense, as the description of a change that was, in its actual texture, gradual and daily and accumulative. Felt first in the coastal cities and the special economic zones that were established to attract foreign investment, and spreading inward from there over years and decades. The way a change in water temperature spreads through a very large lake slowly, from the surface downward, from the edges inward, until eventually the whole body of water has taken on the new quality. The China that emerged from these decades of reform, the China of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with its vast cities, its high-speed rail network stitching together a territory that had once taken weeks to cross, its hundreds of millions of people lifted from poverty into lives of greater material security and possibility, is a China continuous with all of the China that this documentary has been gently describing, connected to it by the same language, the same characters, the same long tradition of scholarship and art and philosophical reflection, the same yellow river running through the same less plains, the same rice growing in the same warm, wet south, the same moon rising over a changed and continuous landscape. And it is also a China genuinely new, shaped by experiences and possibilities and challenges that the dynasties and the philosophers and the silk merchants and the oracle bone diviners could not have imagined, though they might, perhaps, have found in them the same questions they had always been asking, wearing new clothes. What endures, through all the turning and the changing and the loss and the rebuilding, is something harder to name than any specific institution or tradition or technology. It is something like a quality of attention, the same quality that we found in the song landscape paintings, in the Guqin music, in the calligrapher's breath before the first stroke, in the farmer standing in the field at dawn reading the particular quality of the morning light, the capacity to be present with the world as it actually is, the willingness to sit with things long enough for them to reveal themselves, the understanding that the deepest truths come not through force but through patience, not through noise but through stillness, not through grasping but through the quiet, open-handed receiving of what the world, in its own time and its own way, chooses to offer. The yellow river is still flowing. The less is still settling on the banks, soft and pale as old linen, layer upon quiet layer. Somewhere in the south, in the warm, wet lowlands where the air smells of green things and water, a rice paddy is filling with the slow, glassy water of the spring rains, and the seedlings are being carried out to be planted, one by one, in the patient, stooping work that has been done in this same way for thousands of years. In a city somewhere, a calligrapher is sitting at a table, brush in hand, not yet moving, waiting for the stillness to settle fully into the wrist and the shoulder and the chest before the brush touches the paper and the stroke begins. In a garden, the evening light is doing what the evening light has always done, softening everything, making the colors warmer and the shadows longer, and the sound of water more audible beneath the other sounds. And the bamboo is making its small, dry, papery sound in the slight breeze, and the fish in the dark pond is moving slowly through the dark water, and everything is very still, and very old, and very quietly, continuously, patiently, alive.